Welcome back, Morbid Moths. Thank you for joining us on Moths to the Flame. Today, I am super excited because we have a legend with us, Tim Waggoner, who I've been gracious enough, I've been excited enough to meet in person before at a couple of conferences. So thank you for joining us today, Tim.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we're super excited to have you here. I feel like there's a lot that can be learned from you, especially with the craft writing books that you put out, all of the experience that you have. Guys, Tim Waggoner's first novel came out in 2001, and he's published close to 50 novels. When I read that, I was like, what the fuck? Like, how do you have the time? That's amazing. So I definitely wanted to get into that. And 7 collections of short stories. You write original fantasy and horror, as well as a ton of media tie-ins. Your novels include Like Death and the popular Necropolis series of urban fantasy novels. He's written tie-in fiction for Supernatural, Alien, Grimm, The X-Files, Doctor Who, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Transformers, and Wizards of the Coast, among others. So I feel like you just hit all of those, like D&D, fantasy, sci-fi. He's won multiple Bram Stoker Awards and been a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Award, the Scribe Award, and the Splatterpunk Award. In addition to writing, Tim is also a full-time tenured professor who teaches creative writing, of course, and composition at Sinclair College. So we are so excited to have you with us here today, Tim. And I have to say, first and foremost, I'm going to have to ask you about when you wrote STARGATE SG-1, a novelization of that, because I am a huge Stargate fan at Stargate SG-1 and Atlantis. So kick us off with that. What's that process like?
It was a lot of fun because, I'm a huge fan of both too. So I was hoping to do an Atlantis one, but they just had an open call for SG-1 novels. I can't remember if it was on a message board I was on or something, but saw the editor, Sally Malcolm. She went ahead and she posted she was looking. So I'm like, okay, I got to go ahead and try to snag one of these.
Oh,
so I just came up with, some ideas and just pitched it. The normal kind of process that happens with the tie-in, you pitch an idea, maybe several, they pick one they want you to develop into an outline. And if they like that, then they go ahead and pass it on to the IP holder. It has to approve it. Or they have changes, they ask you to do that. Eventually, once they get the outline settled, you write the book. A lot of times with tie-ins, you only have maybe 2 to 3 months to do them. If you're unlucky, you have 3 weeks to do them. Woo! Which happens sometimes. Yeah, it happens sometimes. And it was just a lot of fun to write it. Sally was such a fan of the series. She had a lot of fun, a lot of good suggestions. My favorite was she said, at one point, let's have, I had described some tech. And she said, well, let's have, our main character, here I am blanking on his name now. I say it's such a fan, but Richard Dean Anderson's character.
Is it Jack? Was it Jack? I can't remember.
Yeah, see?
But I think it was Jack.
Yeah, he always blaming stuff on magnetism. And, and at this time, Sam would always be like, no, it's not magnetism. She said, no, this time it actually kind of is like magnetism. And so I'm like, that's a deep cut for the fans right there.
Absolutely.
I did get a little flack because I used Jonas as because that's one of the things I noticed that a lot of the stories hadn't. So, all of the cast was in there. It was after Jonas had left the series. But, I had sort of an A and a B story that eventually kind of collided.
Definitely.
And yeah, some of the reviews were like, what the hell's Jonas doing in here? And they put him on the cover, so they thought it was all about him and that Daniel wouldn't be around.
Right.
Yeah. But, other than that, people seem to like it well enough.
Oh, absolutely. When I saw that, I was like, holy hell, what a blast from the past. I have to go back and read it now. Like, that's so exciting. So why horror? What brought you to the genre and how did you get started on this whole writing journey?
Yeah, it's really hard to say. I've liked weird stuff ever since I was a little kid. One of the earliest memories I have is sitting on my dad's lap before I could read, and he'd be reading like dinosaur books he would get out. Not kids' books, the actual like science books or
Ferocious,
whatever. These are dinosaurs,
Yeah.
And I couldn't read, but I learned to recognize the shape of the dinosaurs' names so I could pick them out of the books.
Oh, that's fun.
And Yeah, when I was little, I had one of my few recurring dreams. I had a dream 3 times where it was all tinted in red too, and a UFO landed in the little cul-de-sac where we lived, and when it opened, dinosaurs came out.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it was really cool.
My
And it's
son would love
scary.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I have a 5-year-old, and he's grilling us on different types of dinosaurs. And oh, yeah. I mean, that's the life for sure. So, what is your writing routine like? When you sit down and you're like, okay, I have to write XYZ. What does that look like for you specifically?
Well, one of the nice things about teaching is that my schedule may change every semester, but I know what my schedule is every semester. So I always know when I have time. So my writing routine may change depending on, when I have classes and when I have time in between them. And I got lots of stuff to grade, but it kind of waxes and wanes, as they're working on an assignment before they turn it in. So I have time to write then. And even if I do have to grade, I grade when I want. So I can pick when I do that in the day. Exactly. So I try to write early in the morning if I can, because if, I found if you get your pages out of the way first thing, nothing in the day can take them away from you, whatever may happen. And I'm not a morning person, but, I have 2 daughters that are in their 20s now. And it's when they were super little, I had to learn to be, I had to get up with them. And you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I've sort of shifted over the years that I can do that mostly. Some days easier than others, maybe.
Yeah. So I think that's good advice about the starting in the morning so it doesn't take it away from you, because so many times you've gone through because I'm a night writer. I'm like a midnight, because when the child goes to bed, then it's writing time, but if I've had like an emotionally exhausting day or I've had a really intense, I work in education as well. And it's like, if it's been a grueling experience, then I'm like, oh, fiction is the last thing on my mind right now. It's even though it can be an escape, sometimes it does take it away from you. So I think that's excellent. I like that.
I read an article once on something called decision fatigue. That if you can only have so much energy to make decisions throughout your day, and you can keep making them after that, but they're bad.
Yep.
Because you can't really judge them. And once I read that, I was like, oh, because I used to try to write at night too, and I can do that. I found over the years I have a writing biorhythm of I'm good for pages every 12 hours. Somewhere in that I can do pages.
Okay.
But yeah, that's another reason why I started doing it earlier, because the fewer decisions I've made by that point when I write, less, burnt out I am on decisions for that day.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I've done everything though. I've done day writing, night writing. I've done writing for an hour that I could fit in. I've done page goals of anywhere from 1 page to 3 to 5 to 7 to 10 to 20, depending on what my life is like. I do tend to speed up when I get toward the end of a project, like the middle. The middle I speed up, and at the end it's like a rocket sled. Yeah, and I may just be writing every waking moment at that point.
Right. Well, and then because it's like the finish line is there, and you're like, okay, now I've got to get to the end. Here we go. Like I know everything's wrapped up. I'm not trying to drop little pebbles of clues and all that along the way. Right. And you can just get to the climax and then the ending. So I like that part too. I think it's interesting reading back through my work. The pacing gets faster too. Because you can tell I'm in it at that point. So, are there any particular authors or books that you would say have influenced your writing style in particular?
Well, I read a lot of Lawrence Block, the mystery writer. He wrote a bunch of how-to books. He was a columnist for Writer's Digest back in the day. And that's when I first encountered him. I was probably in my teens. One day, my dad, very quiet guy, but really supportive, just came home from work with a Writer's Digest. I didn't know they existed. He found it in the bookstore, and he goes, I think you might be interested in this. And I'm like, my dad thinks I could be a writer,
That's awesome.
Yeah. And I read the thing, cover to cover. It didn't matter what kind of writing it was about. If it was about writing greeting cards, I read it. It didn't matter. But I really fell in love with his advice in his columns, his fiction writing, his nonfiction writing voice that he used. He would often pretend he was writing to a class and had students that would reoccur from one column to another. And I just learned a lot from him. And he had a couple writing books. Some were collections of his columns. He had a novel writing one called Writing the Novel from Plot to Print that he revised a few years ago and self-published it. He added in self-publishing because he does a lot of that now in his 80s. He's been in the 70s and 80s. He's done a bunch of self-publishing with his backlist and everything.
That's awesome.
I learned a ton from him. And then when the very first, at least that I encountered, horror writing books came out, like the Tales of How to Write Tales of Horror, Science Fiction, and Fantasy, I think. It was kind of a mix, but that was good. And then William Nolan wrote, he had a Writer's Digest, had a genre writing series, and he had one just on writing horror. So I loved all those books. But I just, for a long time, devoured any kind of book on writing just because it was really interesting to learn about people's processes.
Yeah. And I think, too, it shows through your career because you put such an influence on helping other writers and putting out your own craft writing books, which I think is awesome. So tell us about your book, Writing in the Dark. And obviously, these influences inspired you to write that. Is that correct?
Yeah. And I dedicated the book to Lawrence Block. And I contacted him and told him and sent him a copy. So that was very cool.
That's awesome.
Made me really happy.
That's awesome.
I met him only once at a signing, but he was really gracious. So. But I had started years ago, about 10, 11 years ago, doing a blog. I had tried to come up with a name for my website a long time ago, back when people thought that was a good idea, as opposed to just your name, so people can find it. So I called my website Writing in the Dark, and then I'm like, no, it's got to be Tim Waggoner. But I like that, so I kept it, and I used it as a name for my blog. Jason at Apex Books. I was talking to him at a conference once, and he's like, tell him I'm starting to think about doing a blog. And he's like, do one about how to write. You're a teacher. People will read that.
Right.
I'm like, oh, okay. And plus, one of the things that I realized somewhere along the line when you do self-promotion is that nobody really cares about what you're doing. I mean, not in a mean way, but if you can do something for them or give them something, that makes a huge difference.
Absolutely.
Plus, I'm a teacher, so I've always, wanted to help people. So I decided just to start doing that blog. And, I'd already written some articles on writing too, just because I love to think about writing and write about writing. And as the years went by, I'm like, I want to do a book on writing, but I don't know if I've earned the right, if I know enough. And eventually, and I was thinking about different types. So I had a couple of different proposals and things on how to do writing. And none of them really, my agent sent them to Writer's Digest, places like that, with didn't think about writing horror at that point. So none of those panned out. And one day I'm just like, I maybe I could do this that I could do it. And so my agent approached, Raw Dog Screaming Press, and John and Jennifer were like, oh yeah, this will be great. And when I started to write it, it just poured out of me like water. And it was weird because once I finished it, I literally forgot everything I'd written. So when I first started doing interviews and trying to promote it, people be like, oh, what's in it? I'm like, I don't know.
Just writing advice. You'll have to read it to find
out. Right. Yeah. Hunter Shea had me on his podcast. He's like, oh, I really love those 2 questions you asked all the writers. And I'm like, that's great. What are they? Because I can't remember. I really couldn't.
I love that. I'm that way too, though. So many times people will be like, hey, that's awesome. I'm like, is it though? Because I'm not sure. I'll trust you. I'll trust you on that.
And all the memory finally trickled back, and I was able to remember what was in it.
That's good. That's really good. You need just a bullet points. This is before you sit down for something. This is what it's about, I promise. So you provide in that book guidance for both new and veteran writers. What do you find are some of the common pitfalls or mistakes that writers make in the horror genre specifically, and how do you feel like that can be avoided?
I think this happens with all new writers, but I think it's writing as if they're watching a movie. So the perspective they use is a passive observer observing what's happening kind of at a distance from them, on the screen. And probably no matter how much you read, that's the main way, we access stories. We have so many more hours of movies and TV shows and video games and whatever that we absorb. And because of that, it doesn't make fiction involving at all. But especially in horror, because horror is about what the character feels, how they're reacting to stuff. Oh, I say and I said this in Writing in the Dark, it's an example I use all the time. It's a difference between the movie Alien and Aliens. Because in Alien, they're just regular people.
Right.
Just kind of workaday schlubs that are minors and stuck with this monster that they have to deal with. And so to them, it's a monster because that's how they perceive it, because that's how they interact with it. But in Aliens, we have the Space Marines they've never encountered anything this bad before, but they've encountered plenty of other, the monsters or whatever on alien worlds and dealt with them. And they're pretty confident, and they have all kinds of firepower. And so in there, the aliens are more just like an opposing force kind of threat. It's the first movie's a horror movie, the second one's action movie.
I totally agree with you. Yes.
And they're both awesome. But I
Yeah.
think the biggest thing is that people, they do try to write it like a movie, and they don't imagine themselves inside the character as things are happening. And what is this character thinking or feeling and reacting to whatever's going on? And to try to balance all that with all kinds of things. You're not just in the character's head all the time.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's really good advice. I wish someone had told me that like 5 years ago. That would have been great. So you include exercises in Writing in the Dark for the writers to explore their craft. Can you share some examples of maybe thought-provoking questions that you ask readers of that book to delve into, like questions for writers when they're preparing to write?
That's a good question. I hate writing exercises, so I put them in there because I know people like them, and then I was surprised they liked them so much. I did a follow-up, a workbook full of exercises, but I usually hate them because I hate being told what to write. I also hate being
Right.
told what to read all my life. Couldn't stand it.
Oh, yeah.
But I know that it helps a lot of people. So usually what I try to do is, in the book, I tried different kinds of exercises. Some would be about, trying to get writers to look at what they value in a story or how they might be able to bring themselves to stories. I was just thinking about that again today, how important it can be to, if you're going to write a werewolf story, everybody thinks, okay, werewolf, what's an idea for a werewolf? And I'm like, no, is there anything in your life that you could draw on that you could use to write a werewolf story? So when I was really little, there was a book. I have it on my shelf over there full of influential books, but it was called How to Care for Your Monster by Nelson Bridwell, who's the guy
Oh,
who did
that's
Clifford.
fun.
And
Yes.
it's supposed to be like like How to Care for Your Puppy, but it's
Yeah.
monsters. And one of them, they have vampire and werewolf and whatever. So, just for fun, it was, I didn't think it was real, but just for fun, one time I took I made like a little noose, like it's supposed to be a trap, and I put it outside with dog food in it in the hopes I'd catch a, werewolf. And I was just playing because I knew there are no such things. Still
Right, right.
disappointed in the morning when there wasn't
Of
one.
course. Of course.
So I could pull that out of my life and somehow
Yes.
find a way to use that in a werewolf story. And it won't be like anybody else's. And because there's a certain amount of reality to it, it's going to have more authenticity.
I agree.
I'll be able to
I
create
agree.
an emotional core from it. And I
Right.
think a lot of times people they keep trying to recycle. They can't help it. All these ideas and things we've seen and read from other people. But I think the more that you can write horror, anything really, but horror from your own life, people aren't going to, they're not going to have been there and done that before. And it's really going to have
Absolutely.
an impact. And especially in horror, when it's supposed to be about the unknown, it's supposed to kind of keep you off balance and keep you guessing. Just the fact that nobody else, or at least nobody, maybe a few people, but hardly anybody set their little werewolf trap when they were a kid.
I'm like, why didn't I do
Yeah.
that?
So, that's the kind of thing that I think could make a really good story. So I want people to beyond the techniques about like trying to write from a certain point of view and all that, which I mentioned a minute ago. But
Yeah.
I think trying to come up with how can you infuse more of yourself, more of your own observations, more of your own thoughts and feelings and experiences. I've tried to challenge writers to do that as much as I could.
I think that's excellent. What an awesome, awesome challenge. That's better than any workbook question for sure, to have that introspective point of view. So what about when when a writer is trying to create like an atmospheric setting, or, that immersive type of setting, especially in horror, a lot of times it's places we've never been before. And so how do you advise for them to do that? Like if I'm writing about, Transylvania or something like that, I've never been there. I'd love to, but what's your advice there?
Well, I mean, if you've been to a place similar enough, I mean, you can fake it. And of course, everybody does YouTube videos on stuff now. And so you can watch that and that'll give you some things. But, a lot of it is just if you've been to a place that's cold, then you can write about cold anywhere, really. The sensation of cold. I think a big part of it, too, is knowing what would your character pay attention to. So I always use the example of like, if Scooby-Doo and Shaggy are in a graveyard, and the kind of the graveyard that is spooky and that has the trees with no leaves that look like hands grabbing,
Yeah.
they're terrified. But, if Sherlock Holmes or Mr. Spock is walking through there, nothing. Spock
Right.
might realize that somebody could see them that way because he has kind of an appreciation for literature and the abstract, even if he doesn't feel it. Holmes would not even notice. He would be focused, like a bloodhound. He's focused on what he's doing. And
Yes.
so I try to think about what would somebody pay attention to a character. If you can't think that, just any human, what's the kind of thing they would notice right now? So people spend a lot of time trying to describe things, again, like they're this passive observer. They'll focus on sight and sound. They forget the other senses. And the other ones, they have a greater impact. Sight and sound, we gather information from miles, but the other ones are relatively weak. But because of that, things are all in contact with your body, especially like taste, and smell.
Oh yeah, much
and
more
so
intimate,
they have
for sure.
huge impact. And so you think about, like, if you're not going to be looking up at the pretty stars if you think you see a shape moving in front of you, so you don't describe that part. So it's just kind of, it's almost like imagining you're in a holodeck or whatever, where, you're there and it's you and what's there now. And I kind of imagine that way when I write. It's like, okay, now I'm populating it. And so what am I looking at here in the holodeck?
So I have something interesting to share with you. Have you ever tried any of that virtual reality stuff? They have, so like VR goggles. We have some of those Oculus goggles, and I have some writer friends. We were talking about how you can set up these, you can go on these virtual reality experiences, but now they've made it where you can even do typing and writing and have your laptop in front of you, or even like a digital laptop in front of you, for writers to sit in virtual reality surrounded by whatever landscape and then write and have that kind of immersive experience going at the same time. So I haven't tried it yet, but I would like to. I'm going to.
That's excellent.
Yeah. I think that really, the example that I'm thinking of, my friend Emily Collins, she writes a lot of like snowy landscapes, cold tundra. That's what made me think of it. And so she'll sit virtual reality in like a snow, like, scape with a blizzard happening and that sort of thing. And she turns her air conditioning down really low and like really gets in the vibe for writing. And I just think that's so cool. So
and that's the kind of thing they tell actors to do too. Whatever you can do to try to reach that.
Yes,
memory can be one thing, but the stimulation like that works great.
Like method acting, but method writing. Like, like, see, I'll draw on a personal experience. I was writing a creepy night scene in my first book, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to get this right? And I'm super terrified of the dark, just things in the dark, in today's time. And so I went out in my backyard, and I live in Tennessee, so the South and the spooky out in the woods type situation. And I sat out there and just felt like, and I had I had my phone, and I was just taking voice notes of like all of the surroundings and how I felt and what my body was doing and how I was responding to that. And I never thought of it in those terms, but it totally is like method acting, but for writing, method writing, so I love that.
And you don't have to do anything dangerous. I mean, it's not like you were walking around a city alley or whatever at 3 a.m. You just needed to be in the place to bring those, feelings up.
Absolutely. We at Moths to the Flame podcast, we are not advocating for you to go to a dangerous place.
That's right. Well, I have students that say that sometimes. I have them do like an observation essay, and they're like, "Oh yeah, we want to go downtown." We live near, teach in Dayton, Ohio. It's a small city, but it's a city. Yeah. And these suburban kids are like, we want to go downtown at 2 a.m. and wander around the alleys and see what happens. And I'm like, no, we're a fairly safe city, but unless you grow up here, and even if you do, you don't go do that.
You should know better than to do that. Yeah.
So there's a certain amount of like romance, I guess, living on the edge writers have sometimes, but no, you just need to find a way to touch the part in you that can be afraid of the dark, and that's enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's wonderful advice. So for you, what role does external research play in your writing process, particularly when it comes into incorporating elements of horror and the supernatural in your writing? Where do you go for resources?
Yeah, usually it's more important for like tie-in stuff because you don't know what you're going to get. And so if you're doing a tie-in, especially I've done like 4 movie novelizations, so you can add stuff to it, but you're kind of stuck with what's there. And like I did one for XXX, The Return of Xander Cage, and he had all kinds of like tech. And then at one point he's like on this motorcycle that has like little paddle, like, or flat parts, like attached to the wheels, and he's driving across water. And I'm like, no bullshit, there's no way. So I hit YouTube, and damned if there's not that bike, and there's somebody zooming across the water on it.
I didn't know that.
So yeah, YouTube's really good. You can get the sense of the sounds too, which is really good. Sometimes what I'll do is like if I'm writing just a story for myself, and I'm like, okay, I got to give somebody a car. I'm like, okay, this person's a millennial. Like I'm kind of sort of the end of the baby boom, depending on who counts.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, millennial. So I just go in there and type, what cars do millennials drive or prefer, because there's all kinds of articles, and I'll get a big list of these are the cars they like or whatever.
Yeah, these are the cars they like, and these are the ones they actually have. These are the ones they want.
Yep. And so things like that work really well. So, I tend to write more from my own imagination and experience as much as I can. But when I need to do research, it's, part of teaching research classes is teaching people how to kind of unlock the doors to information. So
Absolutely.
my Google foo is pretty strong, and it works pretty well.
I love that term, Google foo.
Yep. Well, I didn't make it up. It's an old one.
Oh, well, that's a good one. So it's an oldie but a goodie. So that actually leads me into my next question. Since you've been publishing since 2001, I know you've seen major changes in the industry, of course. And I'd love for you to talk about the impact of technology and social media on writing and the publishing industry, because it was a lot different back in the day and how it is now.
Yeah, I'm 59 now, and I started submitting things at 18.
Wow.
The very first novel I finished at 19. I sent it off myself to Del Rey Books. I got a response in 2 months and a personal response from an editor. And that's unfathomable to anybody starting now. There's no way.
Yeah.
There's no way.
And you probably snail mailed it too, and they wouldn't even know.
Of course
what to
I did. Oh, there was nothing else.
All right, I know. Yeah.
I did have a printer, but the printer didn't put page numbers, so I had to handwrite the page numbers on it.
Oh, geez, yes.
All these things that you can't do now. So the technology that PCs had just started around that time. It took a lot longer for email and a lot longer for the internet to show up. But all these developments made it possible for so many more people to write, because it used to take a lot of discipline to type something up and then say, okay, now I got to type up a clean draft to send out.
Right.
And not everybody had that patience. So it was really great to see that, because so many more people try. But then that also means you got so many more people competing with you.
Mm-hmm.
And the editors suddenly become overworked. The agents become overworked. And then once email came along, they could get more stuff to them. But then that means they had more to do.
Avalanche.
And then in the 80s, there was a lot of corporate merger stuff where 3 or 4 publishers would become one. And they get rid of as many people as they could. So you had one person doing the work of 5 people.
Yeah.
Which has not gotten any better over the years.
No,
so
it has
everything
not.
just slowed way, way down. And which made it harder for people to earn a living. I mean, I wanted to be a teacher. The early days of message boards, there was something called the Genie Network from General Electric, which GE, and it was the first kind of message board where it was just text based, but a bunch of professional writers went to it. We didn't even have websites yet, so you could, George R. R. Martin was there, and all kinds of people. Yeah. And they had private areas that you could get into if you belonged to the organizations. And that's where I found out how hard it was to make a living as a writer, and what these people went through and what happened when they got sick without insurance. And I'm like, I'd like a day job, but I think I should have one.
Yeah.
And every once in a while I'm like, we should try full-time writing. And I'm like, no, healthcare, retirement, don't do it.
Yeah.
Remember what you read back then.
Exactly.
So
security. Yeah.
And then with social media, it's great because that's allowed people to do stuff on their own so they can connect and find readers. But it's also like when they first started to self-pump, gas and get your drink at the fast food place. You're doing work that somebody else used to be paid for.
Oh, yeah.
It's shuffled off onto you when you do it for free.
Yep.
And so then publishers are like, oh boy, they can, we'll partner together, they say, but they, most of the time,
minimal
big publishers, they treat it like the lottery. They'll put a little bit of promotion in, but if you're a hit, then the next time they put a bunch on you because they get a bigger return on investment.
Right.
And so, but it gave more power to people. It gave people the chance to find readers, especially in self-publishing, is a huge game changer because, you don't have to sell as many to make, more money. Mm-hmm. You can find your people and market directly to them in a way that, publishers would try to do back in the day, but they might put an ad into a horror magazine or a science fiction magazine. It's not the same.
Right.
So that's been a huge, huge difference.
Absolutely.
But then you also get these waves of what's the best thing to do. So many people are trying to be good and they try to figure out what's the best thing. So do we do violence or not violence? Trigger warnings, not trigger warnings. Yep. This subject, not that. What's an appropriate age gap in relationships? There's one between me and my wife, and I'm like, man, some of these people are like, if it's more than 2 years, you're doomed to hell. So
it's just, I know, but everybody's going to have their take, and
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's something too. It's a great thing because we can get quicker feedback from readers and from any, like we
yeah,
have that instant connection with everybody, but then also a quicker for the cancel culture and the
right,
negative
right,
reviews and all that stuff.
right,
So,
right,
yeah, it's definitely a double-edged sword. I think
right.
a very good thing, but also too, like with social media, there are so many people, and I'm sure you've experienced this too, when people are coming up at conferences or something and you know them from online, but you don't know them in person.
Right,
And they're
right.
like, I know you. And you're like, oh, I'm sorry. I want to get to know you.
Hmm.
But that it definitely, you feel like you know people, but
Hmm.
you don't really know them. You just know them from online. And so I find that
Yeah.
to be really interesting.
That's a huge, huge benefit though, because all of us would be a lot of us anyway, would be so alone.
Oh,
We don't
yeah.
have people that like the things we like. They don't
Right.
write. Even our family members who love us, the closest ones can't understand us the same way, our tribe can.
Oh,
And
I
so
know.
it's a way, it's like, I don't have close friends around me here, but I've got like all kinds of friends all over the place.
Right.
And it's,
Right.
so it's why you go to, Stoker Con. It's just a whole bunch of people hugging each other for like three
The big
days,
horror
4 days.
family. I know,
Yeah.
so much fun. We've only been going a few years, and I love how the horror community just embraced us so
Hmm.
quickly and made us feel like a part of the family because like I said, in Bible Belt Tennessee, we're oddities out here. And
Right.
so it really, to be able to be around just like-minded people that like the same things you do, and they don't think that you're like a serial killer because you like to read
Right.
horror, you know what I mean? Like, so I think that's great. Okay, so let's see how, when writing, and specifically we'll talk about A Hunter Called Night that you had released this year, I believe back in May. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. How do you approach building tension and suspense in your writing?
Well, that's a really good question. Um, uh, if you want to build tension and suspense, you have to build it step by step. And again, like in Aliens, I mean, the second movie, they just run at you because there's so many of them,
Yeah.
and you can mow down, pretty easily. Like it was so disappointing in one way when you see the first 20 aliens get mowed down. You're like, boy, one was really tough in the last movie. Now they're not so
Right.
tough,
Now it's
and
on.
it kind of diminishes the last movie a little bit in a way. But in the first one, it's all about the delay. It's all about the anticipation. It's all about, I mean, that's what the dark is to so many people. We just can't tell. You can't
Right.
tell what's there. You just don't know. And I think that the more that you can do that, you do it by building up sensory detail. You do it by having, people start to become aware and wonder and fear and imagine stuff. You try not to do the fake scare like they do in the movies.
Oh,
Like when
jeez. Right.
the cat jumps through the window. That was one of my favorites
Yes.
in 80s movies. Or
Right.
the analog phone that goes off. They still do
Yeah.
that sometimes. And I'm like, who the hell has an analog phone?
No
The
one.
ring
Yeah.
anymore.
Right.
But those things that work really well. And so those techniques, it's really weird because in some ways you write more and you slow things down, but people are excited to find out what happens, so they read faster. So
Yeah.
so their feeling is like one of speed, even though it's not.
Yeah, because they're
So
trying to
those
get through all of the
yep,
details, and you're just
yep,
kind of like dragging them on and making that discomfort. You're
yep,
increasing the discomfort by slowing it down.
yep.
So then, do you have a similar process where when you're creating unique and compelling characters, like what inspires the characters in your story? Is it people that you've seen, people that you've met, just people you've come up with out of nowhere?
Yeah, all those things. Everything we write's just an aspect of us. So I'll try to touch on a certain aspect of mine. So it's like, okay, I'm writing about somebody who is, they had their first child they lost in an accident, so they're really overprotective of their second one. And I know what it's like to worry about that. I've never had it happen, but I know what it's
Hmm.
like to be afraid of it. I know it's like to be protective,
Right.
maybe overprotective, of a
Yeah.
kid. So I can do that. But then I can also pick other people that I know, or just try to imagine if I was in this situation and I had this circumstance, what would I be like? Um, that helps. Um, what's nice is you can also write about like your friends and family, and they'll never know it's them. They always guess other
Right.
people.
Oh yeah.
Because
No,
my
they never
sister will
know.
be like, "You wrote about me in this story, didn't you?" I'm like, "No, I wrote about you in this other one, but you don't know that. You can't tell." It's
Right.
also like taking bits and pieces. Like I may take a bit of myself or a bit of my wife and a bit of like my brother and wrap it into a character. just different aspects. And then you get somebody, it's like Frankenstein's monster, right? Except you can't, if you're lucky, nobody sees all the seams and the scars and everything.
Exactly. And there are some things my husband and my husband, he's a writer too. And so we'll sit there and we'll talk about a certain scene. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this reminds me of XYZ time. And this person, I'm like, but do you think they'll know it? Like, do you think they're going to recognize this if they ever read it? And then we're like, they'll probably never read it. We're good. It's fine. Yeah. So it's all good. Okay. So talk a little further about the role of fear and the human psyche in your storytelling and how you tap into those emotions to create such impactful narratives.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because you see this on like social media. People be like, oh, horror has to be scary. And it's like, I don't know. I mean, people who are new to horror, or they just are really emotionally and physically reactive to stimuli, they might be scared every single time. But I don't know too many horror people that really are.
No.
The kids in the hall had a sketch they called Boo, and it's about a horror writer, and that's his first book. It's called Boo, and it's one word. It's Boo. And so they see it, people see it on the title, but when they read the first page, they jump and gasp. And then he can't, and it's a huge success. He can't come up with a follow-up. And finally he comes up with, look out, there's a spider on your back. And so when people read the first line after reading that, they freak out. And, it's just a satire on the idea that people don't really believe what they read. It's a willing dream that people go into.
Right.
You're completely in control. You can stop reading anytime if you want to. So I don't think people get afraid. If they do, it's like self-hypnosis. They want to feel that. Yeah. Like the people that, will feel it if they're on a roller coaster. Like, I won't go near one of those damn things. I hate those things.
Oh man, I used to love them. And I found as I'm getting older, and maybe it's just we become more aware of like how dangerous it actually is. And I'm like, oh, this is not, I don't want to do this.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan.
If they put a steering wheel in the front car and let me up there and have gas and a brake, maybe I'd be okay. Yeah,
maybe a brake, right. I know. Yeah. And I love it, but I'm just, there are some that I'm not. Yeah. I would rather just ride the Haunted Mansion ride at Disney World 1,000 times. That's all I need. I'm good. Like, sit me in my little, I'll be fine. Okay, so thinking about crafting memorable villains or antagonists in your stories, like Night from A Hunter Called Night and her panther-like harriers. Like, how do you come up with the villain aspect?
That part's really weird, just because when I was, I don't know what it was, 19, 20, 21, somewhere in there, this character popped into my head full blown out of nowhere. I was in my bedroom. I remember exactly where I was when it did. And I was like, huh. And the name for the character was male back then. And I just felt like gender swapping the character for no good reason.
I like it.
Since 50%, 52% or whatever of the world are women, I'm like, it's kind of dumb if I make all my characters, the viewpoint ones or the main ones male all the time. So I usually just switch, back and forth as I go. And so I just really like the idea of, a character that could, like break their fingers off. And maybe I got it from Subspecies, but I remember thinking of it before that, but maybe I'd seen it. But, she breaks her fingers off and they become like panther-like things she can send out to do her bidding. Just off her left hand. She doesn't have any on her right for no good reason. just I figured she needed her hand to do some things other times.
I made it for a part of the story. I like it.
Yeah. So, that was just, and a lot of that is just, can you come up with a really cool image that works for me sometimes. Other times, it's, I try to think of something that will make it different. My next Flame Tree book's coming out. I can't remember when. But it's called Lord of the Feast. And in there, one of the things I have is, one of my concepts is there's a building that's kind of like a special playground for serial killers, where they provide you victims and a room and equipment so that you can go in there and, you're not going to get caught. And so the grandson of the woman who runs this thing, he's been raised there, he can kill and everything, but I decided to make him ace because he has no sexual anything to this. He doesn't get anything from it. And I thought, well, that's cool. I have ace friends and relatives, and you don't see that portrayed. And I thought, well, what it would be like, because we're so used to this idea that, like, somebody's getting sexually aroused by killing. Yeah. And so I have a scene where he's like he's naked because just the mess. And he's like assuring the guy that I'm not getting off on this. He's getting ready to kill him.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
That I've had a similar idea, but I'm all about the virtual reality stuff, and I thought of like almost like a that movie Gamer that where like they had the prisoners go in and they could play for whatever to try to earn their freedom. But if it was like role playing serial killer type thing, but you just went all on it. You were like, let's just have them go ahead and do it in the room and not even it's like a purge but contained. So
yeah, that's true. And I try to think
really cool.
of ways to if I can get people to sympathize with the villain, or just make the villain interesting enough to read about, find ways to make them human.
Yes.
Like he's frustrated if people think he's going to be turned on by this, because I would be irritated. But he's irritated by this, but it's perfectly normal to kill somebody on the other hand, because people are weird, they're contradictory.
They absolutely are. Absolutely are. Okay, so can you talk about if how writers, especially writers that are coming into the scene, you talk about trying to turn things on their head. We have all of these tropes and all of these conventions that, there are things you expect to see in a vampire story, you expect to see in a werewolf story or a gothic story. You want that creeping dread and the haunted house and the whatever. So what advice do you give to writers, veteran or new, that are wanting to turn those tropes on their head? They're wanting to come up with something fresh and exciting.
Yeah, I just wrote I have a tie-in story coming out for a game called Unioverse, which is you can travel, your essence travels throughout the galaxy by this like star connection thing, but when you get there they 3D print a body for you, so you can be in any environment. Like, so you can be in a methane world and be like cool. A fish creature. Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah.
So so for this blog that I wrote, I was talking about like trying to find ways to deal with, stories. So I said, imagine you're writing a pirate story. You got to write a pirate story for a theme anthology. And so you got to kind of game out, okay, everybody else is going to do the most common pirate stuff. So what can I do? And so I said, well, pick something like the werewolf trap. Like, what if you were, as a pirate, you dressed up for one for Halloween, so maybe you can pull that. And then you just take a spin. So, okay, I'm going to do a ghost pirate. You see that a lot. But usually the ghost pirates are defending their treasure that they had in life. Well, what if like ghost pirate has to give away his treasure in order to like move on? And nobody wants it. Okay. That's the curse on the treasure. The pirate cannot give it away. And then I don't know how the hell you'd work in your pirate outfit in there. Find a way to make the character who encounters the ghost pirate have that, or I don't know.
Right.
But, it's just a simple thing of just taking something and turning it around.
Just flipping it, totally.
Yeah, it can be very easy to do. The other thing is to try to like take a trope and can you distill it to its essence? The example I always use, and I use it in Writing in the Dark, is a character like Jason and Michael. They're basically the same character. They have white faces they do not move. They dress monochromatically. They're silent, and they have like a sharp weapon. And I say, what's the trope?
Yeah.
And I say, what's the trope for this? And everybody looks at me. I say, they're the Grim Reaper. They've got the skull face. They've got the monochromatic robe. They show up to harvest you. They collect you. They're silent, just the way we imagine that. Grim Reaper has no power. It's a toy. It's a decoration we see all the time. But when you strip it to its essence and kind of rebuild it in a way, the power of the trope is there with people not recognizing what it is. So, anything like in cartoons, toys, whatever, a vampire's come along, you have to find a different way to make some kind of trope out of it, because just a vampire itself it's nothing anymore, or a werewolf is not anything anymore.
Right. They're so overdone.
Ray Garton wrote a couple books about werewolves where the curse is just transmitted through sex. And so, they would rape somebody as they kill them or whatever, or rape them and leave them alone, and then they catch the curse. And that's pretty brutal to read about. But just the concept itself
changes
is different.
It. It's interesting. Yeah. That's You've been nominated for a Splatterpunk Award. You're fine with that. It's fine.
Yeah, but in general, just that one I thought was like, it's not just biting somebody or whatever. And if you have to write those scenes and then talk about how people live with that or try to live with that, then they're turned into a werewolf after that. That's a lot to put on a character.
That is. That's intense. Okay, so what are some of the most valuable lessons that you feel like you've learned in your writing journey?
That thing about writing with an immersive point of view, not so immersive that it's just in the character's head. That's like what James Joyce did. toward the end of his life. He was trying to recreate the experience of consciousness, and it's not something you can really read.
Yeah.
Read 2 or 3 pages of it, you got the whole thing.
Yeah.
Unless
yeah,
you
not
just
really
want
though.
the experience, but
Yeah. Sometimes you can go too deep on the POV for sure. There are a couple of writers that are popping up in my head, and I'm like, it's a little much.
Yeah, and you don't know what happens in the real world then either. You can't figure out what's going on. So something like that could work for a short story, but a whole novel might be rough. But learning to write with an immersive point of view was one. Learning to, early on, I had too many chunks of exposition, like a lot of people, and learning to identify those and cutting them out, or moving them to better places, or just cutting them down. I always try to think of what's the minimum amount of information a reader needs to know at this moment. And that's all I put in. Or try to. And when you're in a novel and it starts to get moving on and people are more invested in it, they're okay with some of those chunks because they want to know at that point.
Exactly. But especially in the beginning, you got to get them in there so that they want to stay in the story, for sure. Yep. Absolutely.
And for short stories, to start as close to the end as possible.
That's good advice. I've never heard that before. I like that.
There was years ago, there was an anthology called, they were going to call it A Horror a Day. The idea was it was flash fiction, and for people who are busy, you could read, there were going to be 365 stories, you read one a day.
Oh, that's cool.
It came out from Barnes & Noble Publishers, and they had a publishing arm, and they just called it 365 Scary Stories, and I'm like, all right, fine. Mm-hmm. But they needed so many that they bought as many as you could send them. Mm-hmm. I sold them 9 stories.
Oh, my gosh.
One of them was, I'm the Brian McNaughton, who passed away years ago, sold them like 14, but I'm the next one. So I'm a living champion for how many.
Yeah.
But one of them was a story I'd already written, and all I did was take off the first 11 pages. I didn't do anything to it.
Oh,
and the last 3 pages of it was a story all by itself. And then I was like, oh God, all the other stuff is throat clearing, setting stuff up I didn't need. And it just taught me that end of it. Yeah. And you may not know that end until you're right to it. But if you can begin as close to the end as possible with a short story, I mean, it works so much better.
I love that.
Readers don't need to know every single little thing or a lot they can intuit or understand from context, especially in a short story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that makes me think of, I was just reading a collection of yours, and it had a mother and a baby. Oh my God. I'm going to look at my Kindle right now. I was just reading it the other day, and I felt like you did that for that story where she heard the baby screaming in the other room.
Mm-hmm.
And there was also a short, We Will Rise. It's from We Will Rise.
Okay.
And yeah. And so I felt like the timing of all of the stories in that book, it's just excellent. You have the man in the shower and the drowning brother and all of that. I was just like, oh, this is so good. So now that you're saying that, I feel like I can even more appreciate those stories because they were, you started them at the right spot. That's excellent. That is excellent. Okay. So do you have any behind the scenes or interesting anecdotes from your writing career that you'd like to share?
Well, there's lots. The tie-in stuff gets weird, especially the movie novelizations. I've done 4 of them, and each studio has had a different way of handling the script. So I did Resident Evil, the final chapter. I just got the script. I got it in mail.
That's awesome.
And that one, because the movie before it ended on this big cliffhanger, there's supposed to be this giant battle in Washington, and then the next movie it's just over somehow.
Yeah, we forgot about that. It's fine.
Yeah, so I decided I was going to write the battle. I just decided I was going to write it, and they could cut it out if they want. So I wrote this 40-page mini book, and they left it in there. They didn't care. Anything I changed, they were happy with.
That's
Other places,
awesome.
you change one line of dialogue, they get after you. And I'm like, especially if I did Halloween Kills, and the script would have a character say no 3 times, and I'm like, in a row, because here comes Martha or something. You can do that as an actor, but you can't do that when you write it. There's no way.
No. Yeah.
But they made me put all those back in the way they were, and that's fine.
It is what it is.
For Kingsman, I did Kingsman: The Golden Circle.
Yes.
They gave me a script, and they gave my editor a script, and they were different ones, and we didn't know it. She didn't know it till after I finished the draft and sent it to her, and she's like, "What is this?" And then we found that out. And so, and then never ever, people always ask, do they show you the movie ahead of time? Do they send you materials? And they almost never do. But the director was like, no, he's got to come out and see this movie so we can put that stuff in too. And so they flew me out, and I got to watch a rough cut of the movie. It's the same thing. The special effects were just a little simpler, but they were all in there.
Oh, wow.
But they wouldn't let me take a laptop to write it down. I had to write it by hand. And
Oh,
so they had to stop the movie, and I had to write everything the director said, every line of dialogue, everything that happens. So they had to
wow.
stop the movie every couple minutes. It took like 6 hours to watch this movie.
Oh
I
my
was so
God.
fried by the time we got to the end of it.
Yeah,
And
I
so then
bet.
I get home and I'm like, I've got 3 different scripts because I had already rewritten the book based on this other script.
Yeah.
And like I've had different endings. Characters live, they die, they get married, they don't. And I'm like, what the hell do I do now? And I'm like, I'm just going to put it together out of my favorite parts. So
Yeah,
I
might
just
as
made
well.
my own version and they were fine with it.
It's
But
amazing.
that was wild. I just didn't know what to do with it.
I love that movie too. I love that whole series, but man,
Mhm.
that one's really good. And I can't Country Road, I just it'll never be the same when I hear that
Yep.
song.
And
So
that
it's
was
a
like a
sadness.
huge part of the script. So the other thing I've learned about all the movies that I've novelized is people will talk about how there's not a lot of character development in the movies. At least in the 4 scripts I've seen, all of that stuff is in there. The writers write all that stuff. It just gets cut out because there's not room for it,
And editing
especially
and
when
yeah.
the action sequences become so long or whatever.
Right. Right. Wow, that's interesting. That is fascinating. It makes me want to almost do kind of a comparison and look at screenplay versus the
Hmm.
novel.
Yep.
That's really interesting. So, how do you handle any kind of criticism or feedback on your work? Maybe negative feedback on your work.
Yeah. A lot of people, they don't like to read reviews, but I do. I'm lucky most of them are pretty decent.
Yeah, they are.
But I want to know what I did because you don't know what you're doing. You're trying to imagine your audience. You're trying to imagine this stuff is going to work. If you were baking something, you'd want somebody to taste it. You want to know if they liked it or not.
Yeah, tell me if it's shit,
So,
please.
yep, yep. So,
Yeah.
I'll read, maybe not like if I'm lucky and I get lots of reviews for something. After a while, I may quit. But I want to read because I want to see what people thought. For my Necropolis books, which you mentioned, there's somebody had criticized an aspect of the first one, and I was like, that never occurred to me. So I made it a plot point in the third one because I hadn't read it yet. So I feel like I can learn from
Yeah,
positive and negative feedback. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, but I just seem to escape some of the stuff people get. Some people get some really nasty stuff, and I just don't seem to.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. Maybe I might have a thicker skin just because I've been doing it longer, and I did it before social media, so I didn't, have any kind
Yeah.
of reaction to that kind of stuff as much.
Right.
But for me anyway, I do find it useful.
Yeah. Well, I can only imagine the comments and reviews that like Aaron Beauregard and Duncan Ralston. I mean,
Hmm.
imagine what all their Steve Volpe, like I can only imagine people that stumble upon their books and don't know what they're in for, and
Right.
they're not reading the right genre anyway, and so that's fascinating. Okay, so tell us about your newest craft book that will be coming out potentially at the beginning of next year. Let me tell you a story.
Yeah, it's hasn't been officially announced yet, but it's coming from Raw Dog from their guide dog books in print for nonfiction.
Mhm.
Um, it, what happened was I told you earlier that I had all these proposals for writing books, and once Writing in the Dark it was accepted, I told my agent to throw all those out, and she forgot.
Oh,
so so she decided to send Raw Dog an old one I had that I'm like, I don't know. I called it Let Me Tell You a Story, but it was just supposed to be an overall writing book,
yeah.
how to write. And I'm like, no, I covered a lot of that stuff in Writing in the Dark and in the workbook. I don't want to do it. But like an idiot, I'm like, okay, sure. Yeah, I'll do it. And so I was just like going crazy trying to figure out what to do. And I'm like, okay, for the first time in my life, I may have to back out of a contract.
Oh
And
no.
then I decided one of the things I did in both the Writing in the Dark and the workbook was I critiqued one of my own stories in
Love
there.
that.
And then I decided, what if you did a whole book of that, where it's almost like a
Yes.
mini collection, especially some stories that, uh, you know, published in little small magazine, never been reprinted, to show different things I learned along the way. And I'm like, well, okay, it kind of fits the title because it sounds a little more personal. And
Yeah.
so without asking the editor, I didn't ask Jennifer about it. I just wrote it. And I also was like desperate because I'm like, okay, good. Chunk of this book's already written because the stories are already
It's
done
already there.
and
Yes.
I'm
Yes.
behind on my deadline. So, but it became it's a weird mixture of, how to write a short story collection and kind of a memoir because I talk about where the stories came from.
Yeah.
I hope people will like it. I don't know. We'll see.
I
Jennifer
think that
seems to think
sounds
it's
so
pretty good,
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
so the people at Raw Dog like it really well.
Yeah,
So
and
I'm
they have a
hoping.
good eye for things.
Yeah.
I really enjoy them. They're great, and they do so much for the community. They're awesome.
And
So
one of the
I think
things that
that's
was really interesting about it too was seeing how like stuff I wrote when I was 19 or 20, because they would have the cultural attitudes or things. One of the blessings of social media is to learn so much about what other
hmm
people's experiences are like that,
Yep.
as a white kid growing up in this little southwestern Ohio town, no clue except whatever you might see on TV.
Right.
And so I could see some elements. I mean, it wasn't like I did, here's a story that's super racist. I didn't do anything like that, thank God.
But you're like,
But I
look,
could
this
see
is
now. Yeah, something
yeah.
I would never do now. And so I could
hmm
comment on that, which I thought it was interesting for me, but I think it was good for readers to see that too, hopefully. So
Absolutely.
we'll
I
see.
love that. I love that. I can't wait to read that and to see kind of the progression and just looking back at your old work and being able to
Hmm.
recognize, oh, I would do this differently and I would change this in a story. I think that's such a formative and transformative approach. So very cool. I can't wait for that one to come out. That one's gonna be really good. So now you've partnered with, I believe, Michael Nost on the art of writing genre fiction.
Hmm.
And so I would love for you to discuss what that process of collaborating with another author or editors on projects is like.
Yeah, that book was just Michael saying, let's put a book together. So we just, took some of our articles and things and just kind of picked the ones we wanted to put together. So that was easy. I mean, Michael and I are really good friends.
Yeah.
I haven't, in terms of collaborating with writers, I've only done it a couple times. I don't know why. It was just the way it's kind of worked out.
hmm
The in the old days, the old pros would say, "Oh, collaboration's twice the work for half the money." And in some ways, it might be, but it's
hmm
fun. It's interesting.
Yeah.
It's interesting to try to find a collaborative voice that doesn't sound like either of you,
Yeah.
um, and that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
I
That's
like that
fun.
part. I like to bounce the ideas off people. Sometimes you get editors that are more like that than others. Steve Saffel, the editor of my Alien novel, he's much more hands-on and bounce ideas off of.
Mm.
And so that was a lot of people. Some people don't like that because they just want to do their own thing. But especially with tie-ins, I really appreciate it. It gives me an
Oh, yeah.
idea, of what direction to go into and things that I wouldn't think of on my own. So I
Definitely.
think that works really well. I occasionally will I've only had it twice, where I've had editors, kind of newish editors, but they're also writers, and they try to rewrite your book to a big extent. And I did this when I first started teaching. I didn't know how to give feedback other than to say, here's how I would write your essay.
Do it differently. Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
yep. Until I finally learned here's how to help you do what you're trying to do better. It took
Absolutely.
a while, and I think that's what's happening with those editors, but that can be really frustrating because it's like, not only do you just not, me out of sheer laziness want to rewrite my whole book, but
Yeah.
both of those were tie-ins. And like, one of the editors was like, okay, I'd like you to rewrite the whole book in 2 weeks. And I'm like, no. So I
Yeah.
did
No.
as much as I could, and I think I got 3 weeks. I did as much as I could, and the book came out. People seem to like it all right, but those experiences can be tough.
Yeah.
So I can see why a lot of writers hate it. I can understand why people, would also, they like that part about self-publishing. The only thing is like, it's hard to determine how you grow as a
But very
self-publisher when
true.
you can
Yeah.
just do whatever you want.
Right. That's
You
why
have to
they need
really,
strong critique groups and
right,
strong
right,
writing partners. Got to have a community for sure. For
right.
sure.
And you never know, because anybody can set out their shingle on the internet and say, I'm a freelance editor.
hmm
And next, all they do is change your spelling or something. And it's not
And their
really,
line editing.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't envy self-publishers that part of it, but I think the more that you can work with others somehow, I think you do grow. Even if it's like, no, I don't like that idea, I like this one better. Just the process of doing that kind of can clarify your thinking in all kinds of ways. And I
Absolutely.
often find a different way to solve a problem. A really good editor just says to a writer, here's this problem, go fix it. And you can find your own way to do it. And I often, if I think about it long enough, I find the easiest way. It doesn't require me to rewrite the whole thing. But
Exactly.
sometimes the
Exactly.
fixes are really small. They're not, you don't really need to do a whole lot to fix something. Other times
Right.
you got to rewrite the whole chapter, and that's
Yeah.
about it.
You're like, I have a giant gaping plot hole and you're like, damn it. Like,
Yep.
this is a
Yep.
problem. So now I think that is excellent advice, even for people that are just starting out in the game and critiquing other people's work and learning how to be a better critique partner for other writers too. I mean, that resonates with me because I'm very hard about, I can't expect myself out of someone else. Like, we are different people, we write different ways. So I love that idea of helping them, giving them feedback that helps them do what they're intending to do, not what I think they should do. So
Right.
I think that's excellent. That's awesome. My husband and I, when we sit together and we're writing, we've always talked about trying to do kind of a co-written dual POV type of book. And that way we wouldn't have to come together on the same voice. But it's so funny because we edit each other's work to the point where I have a character in one of my books that is dead. I mean, it is dead him, his entire personality. And it's like I got inside his soul to do that. But it's only because it's my husband, like I can't do that with other people. So that's the only experience I have so far with, co-writing. And so far it's good, but very interesting perspective. Very, very interesting perspective. Okay, so are you ready for our lightning round?
All right, I'll do the best I can.
Okay, what's going to happen is I'm just going to give you two choices, and then you give me the choice that speaks the most to your heart. And a couple of the questions have a little bit further of explanation before you choose them. Okay, are you ready?
Okay. Yep.
All right, here we go. Stargate SG-1 or Stargate Atlantis?
Atlantis.
Okay, really? That surprises me. I'm going to go with SG-1. Okay, vampires or werewolves?
Ooh, vampires.
Okay, they're having a little moment too. I think with Nosferatu coming out, and we're coming back. Everybody's gotten over it. We're over Twilight. We can come back and be the vampires again. So I'm into it. Okay, psychological horror or supernatural horror?
Supernatural.
Yes.
I like it better if they're blended, but
very true. Very true. Standalone novels or series? Which one do you like to read more?
For horror, standalone. Because anything could happen to the characters. For things like mysteries and adventures, I like series.
Okay, cool. And which one do you like to write more?
Maybe standalones because I just tend to. Although I love writing series characters too.
Yeah, very cool. Okay, classic horror monsters or original creations?
Original creations.
Oh, interesting. Okay, urban fantasy or epic fantasy?
Urban, probably.
Okay, very cool.
It overlaps with horror so much. So.
It does, and I came from fantasy first, so I'm an epic fantasy gal. Yeah. Haunted houses or cursed objects?
Cursed objects.
Very cool.
Because a haunted house, you just leave.
Right. And it's just like, oh well, I really want to write a book about like a Gen Z kid that is unimpressed by a haunted house, that like the ghost jumps out and they're like boo, and the kid's like, nah bro.
Yeah,
because I feel like that's so the personality, but I would love to write a book like that. That's an idea. Okay, Lovecraftian horror or cosmic horror?
Is there a difference?
I mean,
yeah, I guess cosmic, because it's just you can do all kinds of different things. You're not bound by Lovecraft. So yeah, pick cosmic, I guess.
Yeah. I'm like, well, that's an interesting question with the difference, but slight difference, just a little bit. Yeah. I'd say cosmic is a little more expansive. So, okay. Which one? This is a good one. Which one do you find more interesting to write? Writing from the perspective of the hero or the villain?
Villain.
Oh yeah, villains are the most fun.
Yep.
Okay, you answered that really quickly. I'm a little nervous now. All right, dark fantasy or high fantasy?
Dark fantasy.
And like the grim dark moment. That was a fun time. Ghosts or demons?
Demons. I can't. Ghosts, I mean, they have a connection to their lives, people, but I don't know what they can do to anybody. And plus they're also proof that there's life after death. What are they going to do? Kill you? You're going to be a ghost too.
And go join them. Yeah.
Yep,
no, and I love those memes where it's like, it's all the ghosts are always in Victorian clothing. It's like, where's my 2009? It's Britney, bitch. Like, where's that ghost?
Right. And plus, demons, they don't have to be from Christian, mythology. No. They can be anything. I like it best when you don't know what they are. Because otherwise, you just pray to God and then God takes care of the demons. It's just too easy to get rid of them.
Scary stuff. That's some scariness. Okay. Do you like writing, and I think I know the answer to this one, atmospheric horror better or action-packed horror?
Oh, That's a good both. It's so hard because I like to write action horror, atmospheric horror in some ways, but it's got to have action-packed stuff in it. So, you could remove the atmospheric from my books and they'd still have the story. So I guess action-packed for
That's
novels.
what I was going to go with.
For
Yeah,
novels.
because you like to write about that. So, okay. Psychological depth or fast-paced plot?
Psychological depth is what keeps me interested when I write, but the fast-paced plot, I think, helps readers. Especially, it's
Okay.
hard to do horror at novel length. I mean, you got to really actually write a bunch of other stuff in there too, like mystery and romance and other things to keep
Absolutely.
it going.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I have to. I'll pass on that one, I guess.
Okay. Ponder that one for the future, right? Okay. Writing in present day or historical settings?
Present day.
Really? I'm
It's-
so
yeah.
opposite. I'm a historical person.
Yeah, people love that, but I feel like I can't get the lived in sense as well.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine the sights and sounds and the smells and all the other stuff as well.
Oh, yeah.
I like reading, stuff set in historical periods just fine. Love it. But
Yeah.
in general, no, I just tend to write about whatever's, right now.
Very
whatever's going on
cool.
right now.
Which is scarier for a lot of people because it's more real to them. So
Right.
I totally get that. I'm just one of these old fogies. I'm like 85 on the inside. So I love that historical horror stuff.
But
Okay.
it helps people have a buffer too, though, because you're like,
Oh,
it's
yes.
like all the old Hammer movies were in the 1700s, 1800s, because, you don't have to, you're not mowing down Frankenstein's monster with an Uzi or something. It's
Right.
the threat level's higher, but there's
Yeah.
also a distance. It's like it's its own world. So
Yeah. And too, you could really dive into the horror of humans and human
Right.
nature because
Right.
there aren't all of these cars and airplanes. And, it's funny though, in writing that, a lot of times I'll have to take away like colloquialisms or phrases because you really have to do a deep study of the language. But just yesterday, I'm writing a retelling of Dorian Gray right now, which is going to be a lot of fun. But I started putting in how something was electrifying. And I'm like, they did this because it's in 1504, this
Right,
beginning
right.
part of the story. Okay. And so I'm like 1504, they didn't have any, there was no electricity back then. So,
right.
have to keep those types of things in mind for sure. So, okay. That leads us to our next question on the lightning round, writing
Okay.
about human fears or otherworldly terrors.
I guess otherworldly terrors, but they're often an expression or connected to human fears.
Definitely.
I kind of imagine the stuff as like somebody's, like the psychology, what's inside them made real outside. So
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. Okay. Monsters or human villains?
monsters
Definitely
are the best.
all monsters. Yes. Okay. Writing in silence or with background music or noise?
With background music or noise. I grew up in a noisy household, and I had a psychologist once tell me, you learn to block to concentrate. If you don't have anything to block, you have a harder time concentrating.
That is fascinating.
So if I go out to like Starbucks, all kinds of stuff around me, but nobody needs me, nobody's going to bug me. So I can write really well there. But over the years, I've learned to write to silence too.
Oh, wow. No, see, if I can't, I'm not one of these go out in public and write anything type of people. Like, if I'm in Starbucks, I'm like, squirrel, checking it all out. So even while medicated, still can't do it. Okay. And then for our final question of the lightning round, writing, if you could only choose one genre out of these two to write for the rest of forever, would you choose a variety of fantasy, like dark fantasy, grimdark, that sort of thing, or horror?
Or
Definitely. Good answer.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So, Tim, thank you for joining us on the podcast today. Please tell our listeners, where can they find all of your amazing work? How can they keep up with you?
Oh, just go onto my website. It's just timwaggoner.com. It's like
Okay.
everybody else's website, it's one-stop shopping. It has connections, links to everything. So
Definitely. And that's TimWaggoner, timwaggoner.com. And then you can find everywhere else that he needs to go. And we're going to keep a watch out for your next craft book coming out. And then what was your next book that's coming out for Broad Dog is Feast. What is it? Feast?
No, that's from Flame Tree. Yeah,
Flame
it's
Tree.
called Lord of the Feast. And I think it's, I can't remember, probably in another 8 months, something like that.
Oh, okay. So it'll be a little while. All right.
Oh,
So
yeah,
we will be keeping a watch on that. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tim. We appreciate having you on the pod today.
Oh, thanks for having me. I had a blast.
Well, thanks so much. We'll see you again later. Bye-bye.
Bye.